In this episode, we're going to be building on our bookshelf app by adding an AWS AppSync API to the backend using CDK. This will allow us to build a scalable backend architecture while still tapping into some of the very useful tools that AppSync has to offer. We will then look at how we can authenticate and connect to our frontend application very easily using Apollo GraphQL and code generation. Make sure to stay tuned. There are some prerequisites to this video that I'm listing on the screen right now. If you haven't got any of these set up, go and check out the prerequisites video that I posted. I'll leave the link in the description down below. And once you've done that, come back and we'll carry on. In the last video, we left the bookshelf application looking like this, where we had navigation and we could navigate between the two tabs. This time we'll be picking up in the bookshelf CDK repository. We're just going to come into our bookshelf CDK stack and scroll down to underneath the user pool client. And then here we're just going to be creating a new GraphQL API, which we can import from AWS AppSync. And this is how the setup is going to look like. We're going to have a name, a schema, which will point to GraphQL/schema.graphql. And then our authorization config is going to have a default authorization, which we're going to set the authorization type to authorization type, user pool, and we're going to have a user pool config, which will take in our Cognito user pool as the property of this object. We will then add in additional authorization modes to include an object that has an authorization type of API key, and the API key config will just contain the name, the description, and expiration, which we can import from CDK. We can then add in some CFN outputs for our GraphQL URL as well as our API key. This will output these values when we do a CDK deploy so that we can then use those values in our front-end application. So next we want to create our schema file. So let's go ahead and create a folder called GraphQL. And within this folder, we're going to create a new file called schema.graphql. And then within our GraphQL file, we can define our types, which looks like this. We have a book type with things such as ID, title, authors, and so on. And then we also have a type of image link and an enum of book status, which fits into the book type respectively. Now we can carry on defining our schema in here, but I want to show you a trick on how you can do this easily using the tools that AppSync has provided on the AWS console. Once you're in the console, you can go over to AWS AppSync. And then in here, go ahead and click Create API. We're just going to select GraphQL APIs to begin with, and then select Design from Scratch. And here you can just add in a name for your API. It doesn't really matter. It's just for us to test things. We're going to be creating our own one later. And if you just go through that step, you can click Edit Schema. We're going to be using this tool here to generate the resources that we need for our GraphQL schema. So if we go back to our code, there's a couple of things we need to do here first, which is basically this tool can only support one type at a time. So we need to remove the image links and book status properties from our type. So we're just going to go ahead and comment them out from the book type, and then we can copy them and go back to the console where we can click on create resources. This has a custom type in here already, but we're just going to overwrite that with our book type. And as you can see here, it's created a book table from our type up there. So we're just going to add some numbers to it just to make it unique. But if we scroll down here, you can see that it's showing us what it's going to be creating. However, it doesn't let us copy here. As you can see, if I try to copy and paste, it doesn't let me. So what we're going to do is just scroll down all the way to the end and click on create, and this is going to go ahead and actually create a DynamoDB table and create a GraphQL API for me. But once that is completed, then I've got this code here which I can then actually just copy and take back into our code. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste that underneath the code that we've already got here. There's a couple changes that we still need to make. So our image links and book status, we need to bring that back in. We can remove this book here as well. And let's just uncomment these two properties. And we're just going to have to manually add these into the different parts. As you can see here, it's created a book connection, which is what we're going to be returning from our list. And then it's created an input as well for creating a book input. This is also missing the input type for our image links. So we're just going to add that in here. And then we can add our two properties in the input object as well. And then if we can keep scrolling down, you can see we've got an input for delete book input, and we've got these filter inputs as well, which is what we can use to do filtering on the query. However, I don't think we're going to be using all of these. This is going to be added into the list books query. It's also created a bunch of these table book filter input types. And you can see here the ID is using table ID filter input, and then the other ones are using table string filter input as well as table boolean filter input, and it's using all of these different variables that you can use on a DynamoDB scan or query. But it's also created some additional ones in here that you can see that we don't actually use, so we can go ahead and remove those. We currently do have a boolean one, so let's just keep that in. We have an ID one. We don't have an int one, so let's delete that. And then if you scroll on here, you can see that we've also got a subscription object, which will allow us to subscribe to events on the API, but we're not going to need this for this video, so let's just go ahead and delete it. The last two things we have in here are the type mutation and type query, which contains all of our different mutations that we've created, as well as the different queries that we have in this schema. And that's our whole schema defined. This is all we're going to be needing for the rest of the video. So now we can go ahead and start taking a look at how we can create some resolvers for our mutations and queries. So now make sure this is still pointing to your schema file. And we're going to come down here and define our books DynamoDB table. We can import table from AWS DynamoDB, and attribute string is also from the same library. Now we've got our books table. We can go ahead and create our DynamoDB data source, which is created off the back of our GraphQL API object and takes in the books table as an argument. So our first resolver, which is getBook, is going to be using the ID getBook, and it's going to have type name of query and a field name of getBook, which should match our query from the schema. We can just import this mapping template from AWS AppSync. And finally, our data source is going to be our book DS that we've just created above here. So just come back to our mapping templates. If you look at what we've got in here, it's a VTL file in this location. So we need to create this. So let's go ahead and create a new folder called VTL inside GraphQL. And let's create a file called dynamo get item request.vtl. VTL is essentially what we're going to be using to interface with DynamoDB. So we could try and learn how to write VTL here, but AppSync has already provided some very useful resources for us in this situation. As you can see on this dummy one that we created earlier, we've already got all of these resolvers here. So if we search for query, you should see getBook comes up with this resolver here. So if we click into this and you scroll down, you can see it's already given us a mapping template, and it's also got a list of different templates that you can use here. So you could come back to this and use this as a base to build out your VTL templates. So let's just go ahead and copy this and paste it into our request get item file. So basically what this template does, it stands for Velocity Templating Language. It's just a way for us to interface with DynamoDB. As you can see, there is an operation as well as the key, which is something that's required by get item here. And as you can see here, ID is using util, which is a function made available to us by AWS AppSync. And it's using .dynamodb with this toDynamoDB JSON function, and this is something that we can find in that library. If you go to the AWS AppSync documentation, you can see that there is a whole section around the VTL files and the different things that's made available to you. So utility helpers is something that we can use to get things, as you can see in here, util.parseJSON, as well as AutoID, which is a function that automatically generates a unique identifier for us. You can go through this documentation if you want to find out more about what you can do with these. Next, we need to create the Dynamo response VTL. We're going to be using the same one for each of them. So let's create a new file called dynamo response.vtl, and this is what we're going to copy and paste into there. That's all that we're going to need, and we're going to be using that for all of the different resolvers that we create. Next, we'll create our list books resolver, which will look like this. It's pretty much the same as the get one, but we need to create a new Dynamo list item VTL file. So let's go ahead and create that. And then let's go back to schema and search for query again. And this time we can go over to list books. And then we're just going to copy in the resolver from there. As you can see here, the operation is scan, and we've got a filter property on it. This has an if statement that checks if we have a filter in the arguments, and then we use a transform function to transform the filter into the required format for DynamoDB. And then the limit just defaults to null, otherwise 20. So our default limit is going to be 20 for this query. And then we also have a next token, which is used by DynamoDB to return further results if we're using pagination. For the response of this resolver, you can see we're still using the same Dynamo response VTL we used before. Next, we'll create our create book resolver. This has got an ID of create book. This time the type name is mutation. The field name is create book, and the other things look very similar. We need to create a Dynamo create item VTL response. So we'll create a file for that. And we'll do the same thing in here. We'll go back to schema, and then in here we'll search for mutation this time. And then we'll just copy over the request template. And in here you can see the operation is put item. We've got a key of the ID that we want to create. It's using an auto ID from util, which auto generates the key for us. And the attributes value are the things that we're going to be passing in from the front end. And there's also a condition in here to check that if this already exists, then we don't want to create that again. So there is one change that we need to make to our schema, and that's the change I created at and updated that to AWS datetime, because these aren't going to be strings. We're going to be creating this from within our resolvers. And we want to go ahead and remove this from the filter input as well, as we're not going to be filtering by this. We can remove some of the other stuff in here as well that we're not going to be filtering by. And from the create book input, we can remove the dates as well. And let's just remove that from the update input as well. This is because we don't want us to have to send in the created and updated values from the front end. We want these to just happen automatically every time a new item is being created or updated. So I'm going to show you how we can do that within our resolvers using these VTL templates as well. At the top of our create item template, we're going to add these 3 lines, which first is going to set a created variable to util time now ISO, which is going to create a time for us. And then we're going to use this util QR, which basically just silences whatever's within the bracket to set the variable of created at to the value of the created at variable that we created. And this will add in those 2 properties to the object that we're passing into DynamoDB, so that when the item is created, we've got both a created at and an updated at property populated in that object. Next, we want to add in the update book resolver, and we need to create a VTL template for this as well. And then we'll go back to schema, search for mutation again. And this time click on update book. And then we'll select all of this and paste it. This looks a little bit more complicated this time, but it's actually not too complicated. To give you a basic understanding of this file, it's setting up some variables that it's going to use, and then it starts to iterate through all the different arguments that's passing from the front end, apart from the ID, to check whether it needs to be removed or updated. Then it starts to actually create the expression, adding in all the different properties that it's going to update, followed by all the new properties that it's going to add into this document. And then it goes on to continuing writing the expression for all the properties it's going to remove. And then finally, it prepares the update expression ready to be sent to DynamoDB. And it also has a condition to check whether this ID actually exists or not. We also want to add in our updated at logic in this file as well. This time we won't be updating the created at, obviously, because this is an update. So we'll add this in at the top, and that should be everything we need for the update. Next, we can create our resolver for our delete mutation. It looks like pretty much exactly the same. Field name is delete book this time, and then we just need to create a VTL template for this. And as you probably guessed, we're going to go back to AppSync and search for mutation. And this time click on delete book, and we can just copy and paste this into the file. This time the operation is delete item, and as you can see, it's just requiring an argument of input with a value of ID. And that's all of our resolvers created, and we're done with updating our CDK code. So let's go ahead and deploy this code now using CDK deploy. I'm going to ask you whether you wish to deploy these changes. Just type in Y for yes. You should create and deploy your changes. And once that's done, you can see that we've got 2 new outputs. One is the API key and the other one is the API URL. So now if we go back to the AWS console, we can see that our new books GraphQL API has been created. And if we go inside here, we can go and click on schema. We've got the entire schema that we created in here. We can go to data sources and we can see our book table data source. And then we can go down to this queries place where we can actually play around with the API that we've just created. But in order to do that, we first need to log in with our credentials. So if we click on login with user pool, We can click on the drop down to select our client ID that we created. We can then fill out the details for a user that we've already created with our Cognito user pool. If you haven't done this already, then make sure to go check out the other video where we create our Cognito user pool and create users with it. If you already have a Cognito user pool, you can also just go into your Cognito user pool and create a user directly within the AWS console as well. You can see that now we are logged in, and on the left here you can see the different queries that we have. Like, for example, there's books, and we can see all the different properties that's on here. So if we select this and try to query it, you can see it's coming back with no items, but it's still successfully making a query. So let's go ahead and try and create a book here so that we can actually get something back. So if I click on mutation, then click on this plus button, it will add it beneath the query section. And if we just expand create book and select title, so these are all the different things I can provide in the input, but I'm only going to provide the required ones, the one with the star next to them. So title, publisher, and publish date. So I'm just going to put in anything here. Test book. For publisher, I'll put in Ridwan, and for publish date, I'll just put in a random date, and then click run my mutation, and we can see that that was successful, and it returned the ID back to me as well. Now I'm going to try and list out the books again. So if I run list books, you can see that it's come back with the ID, but if I add in some of the other properties as well and run that again, we can see that it's come back with that book that I've just created. So we can see that our API is actually working. So now let's install Apollo GraphQL on our front-end application and get it hooked up with our GraphQL backend API. So there's a few different packages we'll be using to do this. I'll add these packages in the description down below so you can just copy and paste it into your terminal and install them. So let's go ahead and install these now. Once we have this installed, we want to head over to our .env file. We want to add these two properties in GraphQL endpoint and GraphQL API key. We can copy this from the deployment that we did on our backend service. So I'm just going to copy those over now. Once we've done that, we can save it and create a new file called codegen.ts. To start off with, let's export an empty object. And then within this object, we're going to create a schema object, which is an array. This is where we can tell the code generator where to get our GraphQL schema from. So the first object is going to be our AppSync endpoint. So we're going to have the URL in here as a string. That's going to be imported from our environment variables. And that's going to have an object with headers X API key and our API key. This will have the necessary authentication in order for us to get our schema from AWS. We also have a second item in here, which is just a string that points to any file in this location that is a GraphQL file, which means we can also have local GraphQL files to extend our schema, which will help us when we come to looking at integrating with the Google Books API later on. But now let's go ahead and create this path by creating a new folder called API. And within this folder, we'll create another folder called GraphQL. Next up in our file is our documents object, which is an array again. This is telling CodeGen which documents to consider. So things like queries and mutations that fall within this path, but isn't generated.ts. Next will be some hooks. This is just a hook we want to run when we run the script, and we're just telling it to prettify our generated file for us. Next, we're going to tell it what to generate for us. So we want to generate a file called generated.ts. And the config is that we want to include hooks in it as well as refetch functions. And then we're going to be using these three plugins also to help us achieve this. The last thing we want is just to add in ignore no documents to true, which helps make the watch experience a little better. Now let's go to our package JSON and add in these two scripts. CodeGen, which is going to be using mcmd-f, which will use our environment files to run the GraphQL CodeGen script, and CodeGen watch will just run the previous script with the watch flag. So let's go ahead and run yarn codegen into our terminal. Okay, so I've missed installing mcmd, so I'm just going to install this now. Then we're going to try running yarn codegen again. And you can see it's generated some output. So if we go over to generated.ts now, we can see that this has produced all of the types that we had on our backend, and it's created this in our front end application so that we can use it with our React app. So now instead of having to manually create all of your types locally, you can just reference everything from this file directly. One thing we've missed is the AWS datetime scalars. You can see that the input and output are set to any. So to fix this, we're going to come into the config here and add in the scalars property, which we can custom define what they should be. We don't actually need all these other AWS ones, so we're just going to remove it and just keep the AWS datetime set to a date type. So now if I run yarn code gen again and go back to generated, you can see that that's been updated to types of dates. If it wasn't clear about what I just did, one thing to make sure that you never do is to actually edit the generated file directly. If there's a problem in your generated file, then there's probably a problem in the way you've set up your schemas or your configs. So always try and fix those and then run yarn code gen again to fix your generated file. Now we can start building our queries on the front end. So let's create a new folder called fragments. In here, let's create a new file called book.ts where we can have our book fragment. We need to import GraphQL from Apollo client, and we're just going to describe all the different properties that we want to get back from our AWS AppSync backend. Let's create another folder called queries and a folder called mutations. Within queries, we want to create listbooks.ts where we can define our listbooks query. We'll import GraphQL from Apollo client again. Listbooks is our internal name that we use on the front end application, so it could be anything. However, listbooks here is the query name from the API, so it needs to match the backend, as well as all of these properties that it's expecting on the backend as well. And we are using a fragment to return our book item in the list of items that we're returning in listbooks. And if you go inside the fragment, you can see that that's the fragment we created earlier, and it should be returning all these different properties that we've listed in there. So now let's create our files for our different mutations, which is going to be createbook.ts, updatebook.ts, and deletebook.ts. The create book mutation will look like this with mutation in the end, and we're just going to call it create book, and it's going to take in the create book input, and obviously it will point to create book on the back end as well. Please note that this variable is using a $sign, and it should match the variable that's being passed in with the $sign on the inner query as well. Where it says input, this can be any name you want it to be. However, the one on the left hand side which says input should match the one on the server like we've got here, create book input. So if this was something else like arguments, that should also be matched on the front end here. It should say arguments instead of input. So let's add in a mutation for update book mutation, which is going to be very similar to create. We'll point to update instead. Then let's do the same for delete, which is exactly the same and just pointing to delete instead. So now let's go ahead and run yarn code gen again. Now this time when we're going to the generated file, we'll be able to see things like use delete book mutation, use delete book mutation, update book, and these are the functions that is now being generated from our query and mutation files that we'll be able to use with Apollo to actually make queries to the backend. Next, let's create an index.ts file, and in here we'll just export all of these in case we need any of these exports elsewhere. And then we'll create a new file called make Apollo client.ts. In this file, we'll be setting up the configuration for our Apollo client that we'll be using for our application. So we need to create a middleware. This is what it's going to look like. So we import set context from Apollo client link context and all from AWS Amplify. And basically, we're just creating this middleware so that we can get the current session from AWS Amplify, which will allow us to get the access token and then get the JWT token for that. And then we can just put that onto the authorization header as an interception to our network requests. Then we need to create the HTTP link to point our Apollo client to our AppSync API, and we'll import this from Apollo client, and you can see that the URI is being set to the GraphQL endpoint from our global environment variables. And then we can link the auth middleware to this GraphQL link that we've just created. And finally, we will create the client from Apollo client and import this in-memory cache from Apollo client as well. And we'll use the link that we've just created. Now we can set up the Apollo provider in our main.tsx file. In here, we'll just add in Apollo provider with the client that we've just created. So we can import that from the make Apollo client file. And now that we have that installed, I can give you an example of how to use these hooks to interact with your API. So our app.tsx file currently looks like this, but let's clean it up a little bit. Let's go ahead and create a new folder called pages. And within here, we want to just create another folder called bookshelf, and let's add another folder to pages called home. Within bookshelf, we want to add a new file called bookshelf.tsx. where we will just export a component that just returns a simple text. And then we can replace this component in here with the component that we've just created. So import bookshelf from our pages. And then let's copy and paste the bookshelf component and call it home. And we'll just do the same thing here. Now we can replace this one for the home component as well and import it from pages. At this point, our app should be looking and working exactly how it was before. As you can see, we can still navigate and it's showing the two different components. Now let's go back in and start using our hooks. So if we're going to the bookshelf component, we can start using the hook by doing const data loading error equals use list books query, which is provided to us from Apollo and given to us in the generated file when we did yarn code gen. And basically what this will do is actually make the query for us, and it gives us access to these values such as data, loading, and error to manage the state for this query. So let me just console.log the values here and I can show you what is coming up. So if we go into the console, we can see that there's object false coming up. Let's just go to the network tab and look at the actual request. We can see that this is hitting our API endpoint and our payload is list books with our GraphQL query. And then if we go into preview, we can see that data is returning list books with items, and this is the item that we created within the AWS console. Okay, yeah, now it's actually loading on the console as well. As you can see, that's how that's working. And it's as easy as that for us to make calls to our API library. So it takes a little bit of setup, but once we've got it running on the front end, our code is so much nicer and cleaner. And that's not even touching on all the caching capabilities that is provided to us through this. So just for the sake of it, let me show you how to actually call the mutation as well. So to do this, let's just make a quick UI and I'll create a button called create. And then to use the create book mutation, we're going to do const create book, which will be our function that we're going to call. And then we're also going to have all the different properties that we had in the query one as well. This time we're doing use create book mutation, and then we can import that from our generated file. So let me go ahead and show you what these loading states are actually doing. So if I just do an if statement here, if loading, return a loading div. So we'll do if loading or create book loading, then we'll return that loading ... I can show you that if I change this to slow 3G and then just refresh the page, we can see that loading text actually show up just before it switches over to rendering the button. So that's what the loading state provided from the hook is doing for us. So now let's go ahead and create a function for creating a book. I'm just going to populate these with some values so that we can just test this right now. So in here, I'm going to call await create book with variables, and the input is going to look like this with a title, published date, and author name. Then I'll just close this off. And actually, I don't need the result, so I can remove it. And I'm just going to add in a refetch function to the query as well. This is why we added in with refetch function to our code gen. And then at the end of this function, we just want to call refetch to load the original list books query again. This isn't the right property. I just need to change this to publisher, and then we can set our on click to handle create book, and we'll just list out our book items here so that we can see what we've got coming back from the API. So now if we go here, we can see test book is being rendered already. That's the one we created before. And if I click create book, it's doing loading again, and then once it's done, it's showing my book, which is the one I just created on the back end. So I could also use the data that comes back from create book to do different things with it, as well as handling the error state and things like that. Of those UI changes in this video, we'll be handling those in the upcoming videos. Thank you for watching. On the next episode, we're going to be connecting to the Google Books API using Apollo GraphQL and code generation. This will show you how you can integrate your already existing GraphQL front-end code base with the REST endpoint. The results will be incredibly satisfying, so make sure to stay tuned. Let me know what you thought of this integration that we did today and how you would use it in your own projects. For more content from myself, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to get notified as soon as I upload a new video. I'll see you in the next one.